All right, folks. Here is the beginning of the AP Euro review. This is the period one PowerPoint that we're working on now, 1450 to 1648. Okay, so first of all, the Middle Ages were not a gap in which nothing important occurred, according to the historian named Powell. Evidence of the events and the triggers that happened during the Middle Ages show us that it actually helped to bring on the Renaissance. There were things that were going on. We've discussed many of these things at the beginning of the course. Sicilian Vespers, not so much, but the Black Death, definitely we discussed. Peasant rebellions that happened as a result of the Black Death. Of course, the Hundred Years' War between England and France, the rise of heretics in the 14th century. The Roman Catholic Church was losing some of its influence because of the troubles in the Roman Catholic Church, including the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism, as we know. And then, of course, the communications revolution that happens in 1452 with the rise of the printing press. Um, yes, many of these things are in the Renaissance period, not in the Middle Ages period, but some of them were influenced by things that happened in the Middle Ages. The Hundred Years' War, if you look at that, of course, that happens starting in the Middle Ages, going into the Renaissance period. Same with the peasant rebellions, and of course, the heretics, rise of heretics, and commercial communications revolution. All right, so now let's talk about the Renaissance. This is the beginning of modern Europe, especially when we look at the years between 1300 and 1600, when we talk about Renaissance Italy. The Renaissance happened in Italy first. We know it started in the 1300s, goes until we say 1527 with the sack of Rome. It will spread to Northern Europe by 1450 as we have the rise of the printing press, have a little bit of a different flavor to it than the Italian Renaissance. Italian Renaissance focusing more on classical humanism and classical texts from the ancient Greece and Rome. And of course, in Northern Europe, they're focusing more on Christian humanism or early Christian writings. The Renaissance will spread to England by the 16th century, going into the early 17th century. We usually focus on the Shakespearean age or the Elizabethan age when talking about the English Renaissance. Historian Jacob Burckhardt is the one who coined the phrase, the concept of the Renaissance. He was from the 19th century. He's the one that talks about the Renaissance as a distinct, different time period, different historical movement from the earlier Middle Ages. He's the one that gives it that name, Renaissance, which means rebirth. And of course, the Renaissance and the innovations that come out of the Renaissance apply almost exclusively to the upper classes. Um, Many historians have argued whether or not the Renaissance really happened, since the majority of the people in Europe did not see any real changes um, right away, at least during the Renaissance. But I think we can all agree that the changes that came about because of the Renaissance will impact the future of Europe for centuries to come. So, therefore, it did happen. The Peace of Lodi in 1454 helped to bring about some peace among the warring Italian city states, all those independent Italian city states. And we see that they will still not be united politically, but that will allow for the fighting to stop between those nations. Instead, they can focus on trying to maintain themselves from being taken over by outside forces, which had also been involved in all of that fighting. As we know, Spain and France and the Holy Roman Empire all were trying to take a piece of the Italian city states throughout the 1400s as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Florence. First of all, we recognize that the Medici family were primary in making Florence be such the center of the Renaissance universe, if you will. Especially by the time we get to Lorenzo de Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, being in charge of Florence. Florence was a republic in name, but the Medici family were, of course, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Lorenzo the Magnificent was a patron of the arts and used his patronage to help promote the family and the power of the family. Everywhere you look in Florence, you can see evidence of Medici power as a result of that. We also see that during this time, Savonarola, at the end of the 1400s, Savonarola, a monk comes in and kind of takes charge of Florence, and the Medici fall for a little while. He will try to initiate a true Republican style government for a while, but then eventually he becomes a dictator himself. And this will eventually, he will eventually be toppled, and the Medici will be restored. Savonarola tried to burn all of the humanistic writings that had been being produced in Florence with the bonfire of the Vanities, which you see down on the left-hand corner. But eventually, the people of Florence will turn against him. They don't like his austere measures. They like their culture, and so the Medici will return to power. We also see towards the end of the 1400s and the beginning of the 1500s the rise of some powerful literary figures like Niccolo Machiavelli. He lived from 1469 to 1527. Of course, his most important work is The Prince, which you all have worked with. We know that he is really a proponent of what will eventually be known as realpolitik. But, the stability of the state is most important, and whatever one needs to do to get the stability of the state is okay. And we know a famous quote from him: since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. The end justifies the means is the phrase that we associate with Machiavelli's principles. Do whatever you need to do to gain control of the state and maintain control of the state and create stability for the state. And that is far more important than anything else. All right, so now we move on to humanism, which of course is the most important I guess you say movement that comes out of the Renaissance. Petrarch, as we know, is known as the father of humanism, sometimes the first figure of the Renaissance, father of humanism. We know there are other humanists that we've discussed in this class: Bruni, Lorenzo Valla, Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Castiglione. All of them are humanists that help to push the agenda. Remember, the idea of classical humanism is what we see predominantly in Italy, as well as civic humanism. Civic humanism sort of built off of classical humanism. Classical humanism, just to remind everybody, the idea of looking back to the classical past for answers of how to make this world a better place. They look back to ancient Greece and Rome, and that's why people like Ficino were looking at Plato, and Pico della Mirandola was trying to, of course, show that the use of reason was God-given, was the spark of the divine within us, so God would not want us to not utilize that. Lorenzo Valla, of course, remember, used skepticism, looking back to ancient Latin texts like the Donation of Constantine and showing perhaps it's not real, perhaps it was a forgery. Castiglione, of course, writing The Courtier, the book that became kind of like a handbook for how to be a Renaissance man. These were all very important humanists. I mentioned before that civic humanism is born out of classical humanism. Civic humanism, of course, focuses on the idea that education can prepare leaders in society. who are active in civic affairs for the betterment of the entire state, the entire society. So you could argue that Machiavelli himself was a civic humanist. Because his ideas, although we see them sometimes as kind of harsh now, were all about creating stability for the state, which would be for the good of all in the state. The Italian Renaissance in the Quattrocento and the Cinquecento, the 1400s and the 1500s in Italy. The High Renaissance will be the late 1400s into the 1500s. Italy in the 1400s, of course, Florence was the center of the artistic world, or the center of the universe for the Renaissance. By the 1500s, the church became the greatest patron of the arts once again, rather than just those upper middle class businessmen like the Medici, and they become the new center of the Renaissance universe. Now, one of the reasons why the church became the greatest patron of the arts again in the 1500s, replacing the individuals that had been the patrons of the arts in the 1400s, is because many of those families that had been patrons of the arts in the 1400s now had family members in high ranking positions in the papacy, even all the way up to the Pope. As we know, there were two Medici popes. We had Pope Leo X and Pope Clement VII, both Medici family members. So it's still a lot of the same families that are patronizing the arts, just instead of Florence being the center, Rome becomes the center because they are now part of the Roman Catholic authorities. Pope Alexander VI is one of the it's a Spanish pope. He is the Borgia Pope, if you will, reigned as Pope from 1492 to 1503. He is the one who is the father of Cesare Borgia that Niccolo Machiavelli admired so much in his book The Prince. And remember, a pope is not supposed to be a father of anybody, but that shows you some of the corruption that was going on in the Catholic Church continued. One of the reasons why shortly after Pope Alexander VI, there will be a Protestant Reformation. He is the one who commissioned the Sistine Chapel. He commissioned the School of Athens by Raphael, Sistine Chapel, of course, by Michelangelo. He commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, which included many different artists working on it. He commissioned the Pietà from Michelangelo. Okay, so just an example of the church becoming a major patron of the arts in the 1500s. The same thing will continue with Pope Julius II, 1503 to 1513, as he will be Pope. And of course, we know Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope, the first Medici Pope, reigned from 1513 to 1521. Pope Leo X will be a major patron of the arts. He was, as a Medici family member, he was said to have said when he became Pope, God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. And he did. Of course, the Protestant Reformation will happen during his reign, and he will have to deal with Luther. Characteristics of the arts during these time periods, of course. An interest in classical culture. So you see classical themes being used in the arts again. Perspective is invented in the Renaissance period. Proportion and trying to get anatomy portrayed correctly. And as we know, centered in Rome, Florence, and in Venice. Showing perspective, we see Mantegna's Dead Christ, showing us perspective. Also, Masaccio's expulsion of Adam and Eve. It was earlier, 1425. Of course, we see more advancements made with perspective by 1480 with the Mantegna piece. New techniques in art, of course, with painting, like I said before, perspective. Chiaroscuro, using shading and light and dark to try to create depth to a painting. Human emotion being portrayed on the faces. almost seeing movement in the painting as a result of these kinds of techniques. Of course, sfumato, meaning again more of the softening and shading and use of lights and darks, along with chiaroscuro to create depth to a painting. Sculpture, of course, we see freestanding pieces again. The use of contrapposto, that pose, leaning on one leg to help balance the piece. They got that from the ancients as well, copying the ancient Greek statues. Idealizing the human form, focusing on the nude body as well, something that came from the ancient world that we see revisited in the Renaissance. And of course, Greco-Roman motifs or themes, like you see Greek and Roman gods and goddesses being portrayed in the arts once again. Architecture, you see Greek temple architecture being utilized again, as well as Roman themes in architecture as well. The use of the dome again, which was a Roman thing. The use of the pediments, like we see in the Greek with the Greeks. You see both incorporated here, looking at the picture on the bottom of St. Peter's Basilica. In contrast, of course, to what you see above at Notre Dame, which was a Gothic cathedral. We see simplicity, symmetry, harmony, balance all being focused upon in these new techniques of art. Okay, so we're moving on to talk about art. In the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci is where we begin. Of course, everybody knows the Vitruvian Man, the icon of the Renaissance, if you will, there on the right. It showed how the ideal human figure was constructed from proportional measurements. Proportions could be projected beyond architecture. It was now seen to painting and sculpture as well. Da Vinci made the Vitruvian ideals accessible to artists and architects of the Renaissance. He wrote a great deal. Some of his ideas were published and open for others to view. Drawings of muscles, the shoulder, arm, neck, aortic valve, etc., can be seen in his diaries as well. One of his most famous paintings that shows proportion and depth perception is the Madonna of the Rocks from 1483. Sandro Botticelli is our next artist. This is where you see how the classical themes from the ancient Greek and Roman world come back into vogue. This is Primavera, that was painted in 1482. Venus, the goddess of love of Greek mythology, was the central figure, symbolizing humanitas, the embodiment of the ideal of humanity, what will be humanism in the Renaissance. The ideal of nature is also shown here. Of course, Primavera means the birth of spring. It was actually a painting that was hung in the Medici home, the Medici Palace, before it's now housed in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. But it was a Medici patronage, I guess you would say. Medici patronage was the money behind this. Savonarola, that monk that had taken over for a while and caused the decline of the Medici before they make their comeback, changed Botticelli's work to reflect piety over sensuality. But those things would be removed after his fall. The Birth of Venus is another very famous Botticelli, as you see here again, showing you the preoccupation with ancient themes, as well as the Venus and Mars that you see on the right. Raphael is our next big artist. Pope Julius II commissioned the School of Athens. Remember, this is the College Board's one of the College Board's favorite pieces to use to just sort of express the ideals of the Renaissance, humanism, as well as showing you perspective and all those other changes. The four branches of human knowledge are shown in this painting: theology, law or justice, poetry, and philosophy. The School of Athens as a whole promotes philosophy. Plato and Aristotle are the central figures. Aristotle, who was concerned with nature and human affairs. Plato, the ancient philosophers' idea of mysteries that transcend this world, the world of ideas rather than the temporal world. So the two of them represent the two parts of humanity, of humanism. Michelangelo, of course, one of the most famous of the Renaissance artists. This is his David that was done in 1504. Uh, Michelangelo considered himself primarily a sculptor. He believed every block of marble contained a perfection from within it that just needed to be released. He was a Platonist himself. He sought the ideal like Plato did. He was a loyal Christian, and you can see here in this work the use of contrapposto, which he had observed by looking at ancient Greek sculptures that utilized the same thing, the leaning on one leg to support the weight. Of course, freestanding nude was also something that we had not really seen a lot since the ancient world. There was a revival of that in the Renaissance as well. Here is Michelangelo's Pietà on the left, Mary holding the dead Christ after he was taken off of the cross. The humanity shown in the religious figures, humanism again, and of course St. Peter's Basilica, the dome, was designed by Michelangelo later in his life. The Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. It is not on the ceiling, it is actually the altar piece. It shows you the separation of the saved from the damned on Judgment Day. And of course, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you see portions of it on the left by Michelangelo, as well as a sculpture of Moses for the tomb of Pope Julius II, shown on the right. The Venetian schools, where we're moving next with Titian. This is moving more into the High Renaissance period. The Ascension that you see on the left here shows the ascension of Mary moving up into the heavens. Just like Christ was taken up to heaven, so was Mary. It was seen here. Bacchus and Ariadne on the right shows you again the preoccupation with classical themes. Mannerism is the next big movement after the High Renaissance. Actually, it's during the High Renaissance, but it's the next movement of Renaissance art. The characteristics are a little different. El Greco is probably the best example. You see the burial of Count Orgaz on the right here. The characteristics are a little different than early Renaissance and High Renaissance proper. It was a reaction against the Renaissance ideals of balance and symmetry and simplicity and realism. It's still realism with the use of color, but it was a rebellion against the perfection, if you will, of the High Renaissance, focusing on perfection and symmetry and balance. Instead, reflecting that life is not always rosy, that life is not always perfect. Using unnatural color, unnatural shapes, irregular shapes, elongating the body, if you will. And this is a bridge between the High Renaissance and the next movement that comes, which will be Baroque. Of course, the Baroque movement is highly emotional and evoking passion. Tintoretto's Last Supper, you see here, showing you the use of lights and darks, part of a manneristic painting, and of course the from Arcimboldo, the Vertenminus, sorry, showing you a man made up of different fruits and vegetables. Mannerist literature, you see literary figures like Michel de Montaigne, a French humanist and philosopher who developed modern skepticism. He questioned everything. He did not accept anything as truth. He said, "What do I know? I know nothing. Miguel de Cervantes from Spain, Spanish writer during this time period. Probably his most famous work is from 1605, Don Quixote, where he is showing the nobility's ill attempts at chivalry, showing the fall of the medieval mindset, if you will. And this is, of course, similar to the fall of Spain by that point. Shakespeare is probably the greatest writer in English history and represents or encapsulates the English Renaissance. Theater, comedies, tragedies, histories were all part of his jam, if you will. Average people could understand his works. I know that that may seem strange to you all because sometimes nowadays it seems difficult to understand what Shakespeare is trying to convey. Shakespearean language does not seem very everyday language to us, but back then it was. He wrote in the vernacular. He used comedies and tragedies both, which he adopted from the ancient world, to try to appeal to the human emotion. The people who viewed his plays would respond in an emotional way towards the emotion that they see on stage. The Northern Renaissance begins in the late 15th century and goes to the early 16th century. And this is where we have a shift from classical humanism that we saw in Italy to Christian humanism, emphasizing early church writings that provided answers on how to improve society and reform the church. They were looking back to ancient or early Christian writings instead of looking back to ancient Greek and Roman writings. That's why it's Christian humanism rather than classical humanism. Two of the most famous of the Christian humanists, of course, Sir Thomas More, who attended your Renaissance dinner party, sorry, your Reformation dinner party, wrote Utopia 1516, trying to create a perfect society. If you look at the right there, you see the only design of Utopia, of the utopian in war, is to obtain that by force, which, if it had been granted them in time, would have prevented the war. Erasmus is the other of the two most famous Christian humanists. Erasmus wrote, of course, In Praise of Folly, published in 1509, where he poked fun, used satire to poke fun at the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, hoping that they would clean up their act, not meaning to start a movement and break ties with the Roman Catholic Church. But eventually, as we know, other Christian humanists will follow in his footsteps, and that's why we say Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Okay, so now Northern Renaissance art. We see in the early 16th century a realignment of the geopolitical landscape of Europe. France and the Holy Roman Empire expanded their territory and their power. They become the new dominant states in Europe. Monarchs used art and architecture to glorify their own reigns and promote a sense of cultural and political unity among their subjects. This is why Baroque art was used so much by those new monarchs and as we lead into the Absolute period. Merchant class was commissioning and collecting art as well, showing their status. Art was not just for the aristocracy. And this is happening along with the religious crisis that we were talking about, the Reformation, and of course the Catholic Counter-Reformation in response. There will be a split, as we know, in Western Europe. The split into the religion, and it led to 100 years of war between Protestants and Catholics, what we know as the Wars of Religion. Humanism spread from Italy to Northern Europe during this time, but of course having a different flavor to it, Christian humanism, as we said, instead of classical humanism. The Flemish style of painting in Northern Renaissance art is where we move to next. This was in the Low Countries or in the Dutch regions. They produced some important artists. The characteristics of the Flemish style: They were influenced by the Italian Renaissance, but they showed more emotion. It's more emotional, more preoccupied with death, and more background detail. We also see the beginning of the use of oil painting over tempera paints. So, oil painting. In the Holy Roman Empire, some of the most famous Northern Renaissance artists come from the Flemish school. Albrecht Dürer is one of them. He was the first artist beyond Italy to gain international recognition, to become, if you will, a superstar as an artist. He was the master of the woodcut kind of painting as well as engraving. He will travel to Italy. He studied there. He tried to master proportion because the Italian artists had kind of broken that code to try to create that idea of how to create proportion and perspective and modeling. He learned that there and he utilized that in his works. He was famous for his self-portraits. This is probably the most famous of his self-portrait at 28, which was painted in 1500, where Dürer himself looks very Christ-like, if you will. He probably did that on purpose. Adam and Eve, also from Dürer, 1507, and Night, Death, and the Devil from 1513. Woodcut. Hans Holbein the Younger is another famous artist from this time period and from the Northern Renaissance. He was a premier portrait artist. He did a lot of portraits of important political figures during this time period. Erasmus, as a Christian humanist, he did his portrait. Thomas More, and of course King Henry VIII himself. If you look here on the right, the ambassadors of 1533, showing important political figures and patronizing of the arts. You can see that they promoted the idea of music and exploration. You see the globe in the background. The backgrounds are very important to the Flemish artists. In the Low Countries, we also see some new themes being produced in the arts. Hieronymus Bosch was a master of symbolism and fantasy, one of the first to use a kind of surrealistic type of theme in his painting, focused a lot on death and hell. He himself was very devout and very concerned with the troubles and the turmoil in the church. Peter Bruegel the Elder, also another one, focused on the lives of ordinary people. And so the College Board oftentimes likes to use Bruegel paintings to show you this shift away from just painting the aristocracy and the royalty and religious figures and wealthy, instead focusing on the everyday lives of everyday common people. And you see that here in this particular Netherlandish proverb done in 1559. The Garden of Earthly Delights is another Bosch painting showing you, his preoccupation with the surreal. Wealthy women in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance also need to be looked at. The Problem of Women was a book published by Christine de Pizan. She lived from 1364 to 1439. She also wrote The City of Ladies and the Book of the Three Virtues. These were all very important books that would deal with how women could be seen in a different light. Of course, they were not appreciated during their lifetimes, but they would be, I guess you would say, cornerstone foundation for later movements by women. As we know, Mary Wollstonecraft, etc., will be influenced perhaps by some of these writings as they will be unearthed later on. Isabella d'Este is another Renaissance woman. She's, quote, the first lady of the Renaissance. There is a big debate that started back in the 70s during the ERA movement, with the women's rights movement. Did women really have a Renaissance? Historian Joan Kelly asked this in her book by the same title, and there's been a lot of debate. Most agree that really no, The majority of women did not, but there are some anomalies. The wealthy women that had maybe that were widows, wealthy widows that didn't have a husband that squashed their ideas, or who had a very open-minded husband. Um, there could be some, as we see, but they were more the exception rather than the rule. The late Middle Ages versus the Renaissance. Of course, you see on the left, you know, basically a laundry list of late Middle Ages ideals. The religion dominates politics. The church was above the state. Dissenters were dealt with very harshly, oftentimes burned at the stake in front of the Inquisition. We did see the beginning of an intellectual movement with the scholastic movement, Thomas Aquinas, trying to reconcile Christianity with Aristotelian science. The ideal of the Middle Ages that man was well versed in one subject, if he was educated, but the preoccupation of most people was getting into heaven. And of course, you needed the church to do that. Literature was based on religion, written in Latin by hand because there was no printing press. The church was the greatest patron of the arts and literature because they were the ones with all the power. And there was little political criticism going on because of how the power structure was organized. Now, in the Renaissance, we see some shifting. The state was supreme to the church. There were new monarchs starting to assert their power, challenging the power of the nobility and of the church officials, a shift moving towards more centralized power for kings, which of course will eventually give way to the rise of absolutism. You see the rise of skepticism, and you see some challenging of ideas throughout literature and the arts. Renaissance popes were very corrupt, as we know. Humanism was dominant. The emphasis was on secular concerns resulting from the rediscovery and the study of classical Greco-Roman culture, especially with classical humanism. The ideal in the Renaissance was that the Renaissance man should be well-rounded and know many things and know them well, not just one. Literature was secular, focusing on humanism, usually written in the vernacular languages, covering a wide range of topics. Focus on the individual and individual accomplishments, and there was a lot more literature being produced because of the use of the printing press, and satire was very important for political criticism, for religious criticism, what have you. So, comparing the art of the late Middle Ages versus the Renaissance, again, just like the previous slide, these would be good for a comparison type of essay question, needing to know the basics. Sculpture of the late Middle Ages was Gothic, detailed, yes, but Gothic, and long, elongated, not necessarily realistic. Usually bas relief, meaning sticking out from a wall, not freestanding. Painting was Gothic also. Byzantine style was also popular, nearly totally religious. Lacked perspective, did not have chiaroscuro or emotion, lacked all of those things. Very stylized faces, flat, static paintings. Use of gold was done a lot to show heaven. Most of the paintings were church patronized. They were the largest patron of the arts. Architecture was Gothic in style, as we know. Pointed arches, barrel vaults, spires, flying buttresses, very elaborate. Renaissance. In comparison, the sculpture shows a great deal of Greco-Roman influence, not just with the themes, many from the mythology, but also in the style. Freestanding sculptures become popular again, use of bronze as well as marble, freestanding nudes a lot, freestanding nudes you see. Painting, of course, their use of contrapposto as well. Painting, you see secular themes as well, Greco-Roman ideals. Even in the religious themes, you see humanistic portrayals of the religious figures. showing the emotion, showing not such big, ginormous halos on their heads like you saw in the earlier period, the late medieval period. Perspective was invented in the Renaissance, showing depth on a two-dimensional surface, showing three dimensions, chiaroscuro, oil paints, bright colors, emotion, more so in the manneristic paintings, the late Renaissance. We see more emotion moving into the Baroque period. Patrons were not just the church anymore, but it's church, yes, and some, but not all. Merchants that became wealthy, merchant princes, and Renaissance popes. Architecture, also influenced by Greco-Roman styles, rounded arches, symmetry, balance, Greco-Roman columns, and domes. Now we're moving on to the Reformation. We know that the Northern Renaissance that focused on Christian humanism influenced the Protestant Reformation. But we also know that there were a lot of troubles going on in the Roman Catholic Church leading up to the Protestant Reformation, leading up to the Northern Renaissance. So, one of the big problems that was happening by the time we get to the early 16th century, the early 1500s, was the indulgences controversy. And y'all all remember this. Johann Tetzel was a salesman for the papacy to sell indulgences or remission of sins to get out of purgatory to whoever could pay for them. And he's selling these indulgences, and this becomes a problem for people like Luther who see this as selling salvation. Johann Tetzel, when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, was the quote. And of course, this money was to be raised to help rebuild St. Peter's Cathedral, but was being pocketed, a great deal of it was being pocketed by the clergy that were collecting the money, and it became a real scandal. This upset Luther greatly. Luther will eventually, who had already been studying a lot about in the scripture, going to the source itself, looking at the Bible itself, seeing that there was not scriptural support for some of the ideals of the Roman Catholic Church, the seven sacraments and all those kinds of things. So he was already uncomfortable with some of the ideas, even though he was a monk himself. But the indulgence controversy, the scandal, was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so his ideas of faith alone, sola fide, will prompt him to break ties with the Roman Catholic Church when he writes his 95 Theses, the central insights of which were that salvation was through faith alone, not good works, that the Bible was the sole authority on what was truth when it came to salvation. The only sacraments that were scripturally based were baptism and communion. They were the only ones that were valid because they were the only ones that were scripturally based. He rejected the notion in communion or the Eucharist of transubstantiation, instead believing in consubstantiation, that the elements were imbued with the spiritual essence of God, but they did not transform to actual flesh and blood, like the transubstantiation belief said. Luther also stressed the priesthood of all believers, meaning that everybody could have their own individual relationship with God. You did not need a priest to intercede on your behalf with God, that you could directly go and speak to God and confess your sins to God instead of confessing to a priest. He criticized indulgences. He criticized the buying of church offices, simony, and other things. The Diet of Worms is kind of where this comes to a head in 1521, just a few short years after his publishing of the 95 Theses. Luther will be excommunicated by Pope Leo X by papal bull This is because he refused to recant. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, or Charles V, as we like to call him sometimes, held the tribunal at the Diet of Worms and demanded that Luther recant his writings. Luther refused by saying, "Here I stand, I can do no other." The Edict of Worms, 1521, it was what we call this declaration of Luther. And the Edict of Worms that comes out of this, 1521, basically declares that Luther is now a heretic, but he is also a political outlaw, if you will. In 1523, after Luther was able to be smuggled away from Worms and kept safe by Frederick of Saxony, he will continue to work translating the Bible into the vernacular German, influencing the development of the modern German language that we still have today, and continuing to publish other works from that point under the protection of Frederick of Saxony. We know that Protestantism will start to spread from here. The northern German states largely convert to Lutheranism for political reasons. Many of those princes, like Frederick of Saxony, turned to Lutheranism ultimately so they could gain more power in their own lands. They could confiscate the church land, they could exercise their own authority, get out from under the thumb of the clergy and the Pope, not have to pay those taxes to the Pope every year, etc. So even though Luther himself started the Protestant Reformation for spiritual reasons, eventually the movement in Germany does become politicized, if you will. In Denmark and Sweden, you see the spread of Protestantism there. It was a little spread beyond northern Germany and Scandinavia, however, in this first wave, this first generation of Protestantism. But that will change as we move into the second half of the 16th century. By the time in Germany we get to the 1520s, we see that the German peasants, seeing Luther's rebellion against the spiritual authorities, they will become inspired to rebel against their political authorities and rebel against their landlords. This will be the largest armed rebellion in Europe prior to the French Revolution, which is saying something. A large, widespread peasant revolt. It's hard to organize a peasant revolt, so the fact that this one was so large and well organized, you do need to take note of that. The peasants of southwest Germany, reading Luther's ideas, New Testament, rose up against the landlords and the taxation and other feudal practices required of them and rebelled. Luther, however, did not think this was a good idea, and he argued that they should be put down. He was a religious revolutionary, not a political one. And it makes sense because, of course, those German princes that these peasants are revolting against are the ones that are protecting Luther from, because he is an outlaw in the eyes of the church and of the Holy Roman Emperor. So he's not going to support a peasant revolt against the people who are protecting him. The Second Reformation, if you will, happens between 1525 and 1564. This is where the Reformation does start to spread. There were a few earlier attempts to form some kind of compromise between the groups in Germany that were fighting against each other, the Catholics and the Protestants. The Diet of Speyer permitted princely territories to decide religious matters on their own, sort of a precursor to what eventually will be the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. But the Diet of Speyer, it only lasted 3 years. When Charles V tried to re-Catholicize Germany after that, it fell apart. The League of Schmalkalden will form after that in 1531, where these Lutheran princes once again banded together for the mutual defense. And this will lead to the wars continuing. Eventually, there will be a compromise, a truce ending the wars of religion in Germany at least until the 30 Years' War. That will be the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, where it was determined the princes in Germany could choose the religion in their region, cuius religio, ius regio, sorry, cuius regio, ius religio, his region, his religion. Catholics or Protestants could move to the appropriate states. If you were not Catholic and your prince was Catholic, you either had to convert or get out. If your prince was Protestant and you were not Protestant, again, you needed to either convert or get out. This, of course, resulted in permanent religious division in Germany and affirmed the independence of Germanic states. They would not unify as one nation, as we know, until 1871. This religious division was one of the things that barred unification from being possible until that time, until Bismarck. Northern part of Germany will remain predominantly Lutheran, Protestant. The southern part of Germany will remain predominantly Catholic. Here is a map showing you that division after the Peace of Augsburg. The spread of Protestantism. Now we're going to talk about some other Protestant groups. The Anabaptists are another one in Zurich, Switzerland. They did not believe in infant baptism. They thought only adults could decide to commit to Christ, so they only believed in adult baptism. Radical Anabaptists went even farther, instituting polygamy, meaning marrying more than one wife. They believed all books should be burned except for the Bible. The Bible is the only book that they believed was necessary, and they began killing Lutherans and Catholics also. So these radical Anabaptists were seen as troublemakers and dangerous. This will lead to the tragedy in Münster, 1534, where a joint army of Catholics and Lutherans, oddly enough, surrounded the city and burned the radicals. The bodies would be hung in the cages on top of the castles for everybody to see for quite some time. Y'all remember us showing you that picture before of the cages. Anyhow, here's the spread of Anabaptism between 1525 and 1550, the hot points, if you will. Ulrich Zwingli was another Protestant reformer. He came to your dinner party as well, if you recall. He was part of the Swiss Reformation in Switzerland. He saw the Eucharist as only symbolic. He took it even one step beyond what Luther had done with consubstantiation and said, nah, it doesn't obtain the Spirit of God either. It's just symbolic. It's not the actual presence of Christ. It's not actually converted into flesh or blood like transubstantiation either. It is just symbolic. The Colloquy of Marburg in 1529 is where he and Luther debate these ideas. And there will be I guess you would say, a rift between them as a result over this issue with the Eucharist. John Calvin is another Protestant reformer, also Switzerland. He originally, remember, was from France, but he found it prudent to leave France and go to Switzerland because of his Protestant beliefs, his break with the Roman Catholic Church. He will end up in Geneva by 1540. And under Calvin, Geneva, Switzerland will become the new center of the Reformation, the home for Protestant exiles from England, Scotland, and France also. There were, even though England and Scotland will eventually be Protestant, the Anglican Church or Church of England was not seen by many as Protestant enough. And those Puritans, if you will, wanted more Calvinist type beliefs, so they would eventually, many of them will be exiled to Geneva, or found it necessary to move. They were the most militant. The Calvinists were the most militant. They believed in the Protestant work ethic, that if you were successful because you worked hard, you were successful because God was smiling on you and he allowed you to have that success. Presbyterians, Huguenots, Dutch Reformed Church, Puritans, all are part of Calvinism. Now remember, John Calvin's works in his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, published in 1536, outlined a lot of these principles of Calvinism. But the biggest thing that we get out of that, of course, is the Calvinist belief in predestination. That God is all knowing and already knows before you're even born if you are saved or one of the elect or not. There's no way you could ever know for sure during your lifetime, but you might show outward signs of that. If you were successful, if you were good, if you were moral, but it's not like those things earn you salvation. It is predetermined before you're born. The English Reformation, of course, this is the big old soap opera we talked about before with Henry VIII and all the wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. The Anglican Church was what will be the result of this. It happens with the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which will make the king officially the head of the church. Remember, Henry VIII did this because he wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, who had not been able to give him a son that survived infancy, even though they had a daughter. Anyhow, the point being, it will remove the Pope from the head of the church in England and put the king or the monarch at the head of the church instead. But very little else changed. Yes, the Catholic lands were confiscated by the king. Now about 25% of all lands belong to the king instead of belonging to the Catholic Church in England. And Henry VIII will sell those lands off to the highest bidder. A lot of wealthy merchant class, middle class folks will purchase those lands, who now have a vested interest in keeping England Protestant so they can keep those lands. It also supplied money that Henry needed as a new monarch to raise his own armies and fight his own wars and not be dependent upon the nobles. So that's part of that new monarch movement as well. Ultimately, very little changed, however, spiritually in the Anglican Church. So when we look at the English Reformation, what we really get out of this is that this was a reformation, a breaking of ties with the Roman Catholic Church for political reasons first. Henry VIII's Reformation was not a spiritual reformation. Instead, it was a political move done for political motives. Eventually, later on, there will be movements to more spiritually reform the Anglican Church. Those Puritans were pushing for it, but it was done for political reasons initially. The Act of Succession in 1534 will state that all the king's subjects had to take an oath of loyalty to the king now as the head of the Anglican Church, and if they refuse to do so, they are seen as committing treason against the king and against the state. Remember Sir Thomas More, even though he was great friends and an advisor of Henry VIII, will refuse to sign off on the Act of Succession and therefore will lose his head. This will eventually lead to the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, where there are some English Catholics who are trying to rebel against what the king had done. It will be put down mercilessly by the king, and Protestantism will remain in England. This will lead to the Statute of the Six Articles in 1539, where the Anglican Church maintained most of the Catholic doctrines, like I said, 7 sacraments, transubstantiation, celibacy for the clergy, etc., but not putting the Pope anywhere in authority in the church. The king instead is the head of the church. Tudor succession, of course, is a big part of this. Like I said before, eventually Henry will finally get his son with his third marriage. Edward VI will be his heir. He will reign from 1547 to 1553. During his reign, he was a sickly and very young and sickly. He had a regent council that tried to kind of push their own Calvinist agenda while he was king. So England does adopt some Calvinism during his reign. New doctrines will be established, like the idea of salvation by faith alone, denial of transubstantiation, trying to reduce the sacraments to two, baptism and communion. That will not last very long because he dies so early before he's ever married, so he has no heir. His eldest sister, the first daughter of Henry VIII with Catherine of Aragon, will become the next monarch. Tudor monarch Mary Tudor will reign from 1553 to 1558, and she was Catholic. She will try to reimpose Catholicism in England. She rescinded the Reformation legislation like the Act of Supremacy, etc. She starts to respond to the Protestants by killing them. They call her Bloody Mary because of that. Many Protestants will flee. They are called Marian exiles, fearing persecution. She marries the King of Spain. So if they had had a child, that child could be the monarch of England and of Spain, and many worry that this would mean that England would be subject to Spain, and this would be a problem. She dies before she ever has a child, and therefore her sister Elizabeth will become queen, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. Elizabeth will reign from 1558 to 1603. She is the Virgin Queen. She refuses to marry, even though King Philip of Spain, her brother-in-law, previous brother-in-law before the death of her half-sister Mary, tries to court her, and she says nope. The Elizabethan settlement is important to her reign, where Protestant views will be reinforced once again. She was raised Protestant. She was raised Anglican. She was a politique, as we've discussed before, navigating this compromise between the more conservative Anglican church and those that wanted to push for more Puritan or Calvinist ideas in this Anglican church and this Protestant English church. She and Parliament required conformity to the Anglican church. You had to be an official member of the church. You had to pay your tithe to the Anglican church. But in your private homes, you could worship however you like. This will eventually culminate in the 39 Articles of 1563, which defined the creed of the Anglican Church. Here's another visual showing you the kings where they stood on Catholic versus Protestant, and it goes all the way through William III. The Counter-Reformation and Baroque art in this section. Pope Paul III is probably the most important pope in reforming the church and in challenging Protestantism. Remember, the Catholic Counter-Reformation was a two-pronged effort. It was a reformation of the Catholic Church, but it was also a counterattack on Protestantism. At the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, we will see the tools of the Catholic Reformation outlined. It established the Catholic dogma for the next 400 years. They believed, and they reasserted at the Council of Trent, in the equal validity of Scripture, of church traditions, and of the writings of early church fathers. They emphasized that salvation was obtained both by good works and by faith. They validated the importance of all 7 sacraments. They also emphasized monasticism, the importance of monks, the importance of celibacy of the clergy, and they reaffirmed that purgatory was an actually true thing. They approved the Index of Forbidden Books, or Index of Prohibited Books, as it's sometimes called. Things that were seen as heretical were put on this list. And they initiated some reforms, curtailing the sale of indulgences and the sale of church offices. Bishops would have more control over the clergy and make sure that they did what they were supposed to do. Seminaries would be established to better educate the clergy so they wouldn't end up becoming more corrupt, etc. New religious orders would be founded also as part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The Jesuits were founded in 1540 by Ignatius Loyola of Spain. His three goals were to reform the church through education, to spread the gospel to pagans, and to fight Protestantism. The Inquisition was another thing that was initiated in the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Jesuits oversaw both the Spanish and the Italian Inquisitions beginning in 1542, where they persecute Jews throughout Europe as well as Protestants and Muslims. Protestants were now added to the list of heretics that could be brought before the Inquisition, and torture, etc., could be done in order to force them to recant, oftentimes burning them at the stake, beating them to death. Y'all remember doing your witch hunt around Halloween. Baroque art and music began in the Catholic Reformation countries. It became a tool for the Catholic Counter-Reformation, for the Catholic Church to teach in a concrete and emotional way the faithful, and to demonstrate the glory and power of the Roman Catholic Church. It will eventually, however, this style will spread to Protestant countries, even though it began as a tool of the Catholic Counter-Reformation to show the glory and grandeur of the Church and of God, and of the, quote, proper religion. Baroque art in the 17th century will start with the Italian Baroque artists that embraced a more dynamic and complex aesthetic. Really, the Italian Baroque artists were born out of the Mannerist movement. You see dramatic theatricality and grandiose scale in Baroque art. You see elaborate ornateness characterizing the art and architecture of the period. In your face, big, wild use of colors, wild emotion being shown. Baroque art production further suggests the role that art played in supporting the aims of the Catholic Church as well. Grandiose glory, lots of gold, almost gaudy, if you will, emotion, color, you name it. You can see different examples of Baroque art on this slide. Baroque sculpture and architecture in Italy. Of course, we have one of the most famous sculptors and architects was Bernini. Part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. He was patronized by the papacy. He was inspired by an earlier Baroque artist, Caravaggio, who did a lot of very violent and passionate and emotional art. He was a sculptor primarily, but eventually he will also do a lot of architecture as well. Bernini is probably left his greatest imprint on the city of Rome than any other artist, because as St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican apartments are being redesigned and redone during this time period, his fingerprints are all over it. He was patronized by the papacy to design a lot of that. So you see the Piazza Navona here, the Fountain of the Four Rivers, portrayed here, and you can see a replica of that in Epcot Center in Italy, in Epcot. Bernini's St. Peter's Square, you see on the left here, and his baldacchino, which is the seat of St. Peter's, kind of like a canopy over the altar, if you will, within St. Peter's itself. Lots of gold, lots of bronze, very ornate, highly stylized. Trevi Fountain, also you see here. Actually, that's the one you see in Epcot, Trevi Fountain, a replica of that. And of course, his David, showing you a lot more emotion and movement. That's what you see in Baroque art. And of course, this is probably one of his most famous works, is actually in St. Peter's Basilica, St. Teresa in Ecstasy. And you see the angel has an arrow in his hand trying to pierce her heart with the ecstasy of Christ and the gold showering down on her at like the Holy Spirit. Her ecstasy is through her spiritual renewal through Christ and through the Holy Spirit. It's a very sensual piece. Italian Baroque painting. Baroque art reaches out to people and provokes action and reaction and emotion. It's designed to give a spontaneous personal experience. You're supposed to react to it. Baroque paintings are filled with dramatic movement, striking contrasts of light and dark, vivid colors, and earthly realism. Baroque artists depicted the heroic acts of martyrs, since the Roman Catholic Church was the primary patron of Baroque art initially. Eventually, it will also be patronized by the absolute monarchs throughout Europe. But because it started off as a Catholic Church thing, they were depicting the acts of martyrs and saints to inspire the lower classes to accept their own suffering and not lose faith in the Roman Catholic Church. Caravaggio was the first important painter of the Baroque period from Italy. Highly emotional scenes, use of tenebrism. He's considered a realist in an age of idealists, and he was criticized initially for his use of ordinary, gritty people as models for even his religious paintings. It's very scandalous. Here is his Bacchus. Now you see here a little bit of the old preoccupation in Italy with classical themes when you look at the Bacchus. But the style is very Baroque with the light features on the dark background, the play and the light and the dark, the shading. David with the head of Goliath you see on the right. Very violent. I mean, you even see, look at the face of the Goliath. You see the blood dripping from the head. Very emotional. Basket of fruit. What's usually pointed out about this basket of fruit is many of the pieces of fruit are rotting. They are overly ripe. You even see flies on them, showing you decay and the fact, the idea that, the decay of our world, and we need to accept our suffering and accept that God is the only way we can get out of this. And we need to accept the power of the Roman Catholic Church to deliver that salvation to us, etc., etc., trying to reinforce that idea in the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The Crucifixion of St. Peter is probably one of his most important pieces, showing Peter as he's just being hoisted up. Of course, remember, he was crucified upside down, refusing to be crucified the same way his Lord was. Northern European Baroque art you can see continue in places in Northern Europe. Peter Paul Rubens is probably one of the most famous from the Netherlands. It was divided into two parts, remember, the Northern Netherlands, which is present-day Netherlands, and the Southern Netherlands, which is present-day Belgium. And some of it is now part of France as well. Each was usually referred to as Holland in the north or Flanders in the south. Sometimes we say the Dutch Republic will be the northern part as well. We've talked about the different names for these places before. Rubens and his workshop dominated the art of the Flanders school as we move into the Baroque period with the creation of dramatic and powerful religious altarpieces and portraits of the ruling families of Italy and France. Emphasizing color and sensuality, the nudes as Roman goddesses, nymphs, saints, and angels, all the same. Melodramatic contrast, monumental size, mainly Christian subjects, but not always. Rubens' Fall of Man is seen on the left and his Three Graces on the right. Rubens' pieces are seen as very sensual, very fleshy, if you will, and sensual. And oftentimes now you will hear of people sometimes referring to women, certain women, as being Rubenesque, meaning kind of, plump and sumptuous. And that whole idea came from wealthy. If you were wealthy enough to be well fed, that showed some kind of worth in society. So Rubenesque, as you see here. Rembrandt was another part of this movement, of this Baroque movement. The Dutch artist during the Dutch Golden Age, probably the most famous of all Dutch artists from this period is Rembrandt. He painted in Amsterdam, which was a city that was known to be religiously tolerant. He himself valued his personal privacy, thus it was really unknown what his belief system was, whether he was Catholic or Protestant. He had some personal tragedies in his life. His wife died, three of his four children died, and he became bankrupt. He was known for self portraits, more than 90 of them. Very prolific. Here's one of them on the right, it's from 1658. He had a very narrow color range, though: browns, reds, beige. Pinpoint style with light to illuminate a point and then the light flowing out from that point. This is known as a painterly style, where he layers the paint to create the depth and to create the depth of color and the depth of emotion ultimately. Here his Rembrandt's The Night Watch, showing you the light coming from outside the painting, the light source coming from outside the painting and showing on the dominant figures. The anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp on the left, and the Return of the Prodigal Son on the right. Again, light source coming from outside the painting, washing over the figures, showing the important figures, the light on the faces, keeping the others in the dark. Baroque art in Spain, probably the most famous, is Diego Velázquez. He was a court painter for King Philip IV. He was a favorite, if you will, so much a favorite that he was able to be moved into the palace, showing you the Spanish golden age of Baroque art. He was the most important portrait artist in Spain. Loose brush technique. He used a great deal, less stylized than Rembrandt. But you see here, probably one of his most famous, the Las Meninas, 1656, showing you some of the court figures and himself painting. You see he's looking out at us. You see he has the paintbrush in his hand, he has the palette in his left hand. Interesting, he painted himself into the painting. Velázquez Philip IV and his Los Barrocos, which is a Bacchian scene. Baroque music, highly complex, polyphonic musical texture, lots of notes, rich and expressive. The use of church organ and harpsichord was very popular. They did have even improvisation, even before jazz. Some of the most important of the Baroque composers were Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi. Again, lots and lots of notes, lots of trills, lots of, lots of notes. We listened to some in class. The results of the Reformation, of course, the unity of Western Christianity was shattered forever. Northern Europe will be predominantly Protestant. Most of Germany, Austria, parts of Austria, and the Netherlands. Austria will officially be a Catholic country. Let me make that correction there. But there were parts in the northern part of Austria, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Britain, and much of France. Parts of France, it should say. You see all those dots there. Those are the Huguenot centers. France, again, like Austria, will be officially Catholic, even though they will have some pockets of Protestantism here and there. Religious enthusiasm will be rekindled, however, as a result of the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Church abuses will somewhat be remedied. Simony, pluralism, immoral and uneducated clergy will be removed. This led to a rise of religious wars in Europe over the next century. The wars of religion will be very contentious, will not be resolved really until 1648 with the end of the 30 Years' War. Now we're moving on to the Wars of Religion, 1559 to 1648. All right, so what were the issues? First of all, we know that there was some competition between nations that got involved in this. Spain was seeking to crush Protestantism throughout Western Europe, as well as Islam in the Mediterranean region. The French Catholics were trying to stop the Huguenots, meaning the French Calvinists, in France. The Holy Roman Emperor was trying to reimpose Catholicism in Germany, the Peace of Augsburg wearing thin for him. Calvinist Netherlands were trying to break away from Spain, from Spanish control. And in England, a civil war between the Puritans and the Anglicans, Puritans being Protestants that wanted the Anglican Church, which was also Protestant but was like Catholic light, wanting to purify the church more, make it more Protestant in its practices. Okay, so Spain under Philip II between 1556 and 1598 was experiencing a golden age. At the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, this was considered the turning point in preserving Christian Europe from the Turkish advance. The Spanish were successful in repelling the Turks in the Mediterranean region, and thus it was a victory for not just Christianity in Western Europe, but in particular Catholicism. The Dutch Revolt was Spain, of course, versus the Netherlands. This is where William of Orange, the Elder, was able to lead 17 provinces against the Spanish Inquisition, and he was successful. This will lead to the formation of the Dutch Republic in 1581. There will still be a portion of the Netherlands that will remain in Spanish control, but the Dutch Republic will be free from Spanish control. We also know that Spain fought against England, especially after the death of Queen Mary Tudor. Once Queen Elizabeth became the queen, and she rebuffed the advances of Philip II for marriage, he will build an armada, Spanish armada, to try to defeat and invade England, and he will be unsuccessful. The British will win. 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada is a victory for Protestantism, but more importantly for Elizabeth, a victory for England. French Wars of Religion. There were at least 9 going on between the years 1562 and 1598. After the death of Henry II, one of the Valois kings in 1559, a power struggle between the 3 branches of the royal family, 3 noble families, were vying for the throne. The Valois, of course, the family of Henry II, the Bourbon, Bourbon, and the Guise. This power struggle between these 3 branches of the royal family will eventually lead to different sides being taken during different points of the war. The Bourbons, the Bourbons were had a great deal of that family that were actually Huguenots. This will eventually lead to an attempt at a compromise between the Valois and the Bourbon, with a marriage alliance between Henry of Navarre and Marie de Medici. But there will be the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, after the wedding festivities had happened, is a result of this. This will lead to a widespread persecution of Protestants throughout France, but the marriage did take place. There will eventually be the War of the Three Henrys that comes about after this. Ultimately, Henry of Navarre, who had married the Princess Marie de Medici, will eventually come out on top of the War of the Three Henrys. He will become Henry IV. He will convert from Protestantism to Catholicism, back to Catholicism, saying that Paris is worth a mass. And as Henry IV of France, reigning from 1589 to 1610, he will sign the Edict of Nantes in 1589, where he recognizes that Catholicism will remain the official religion of France, but they will have religious toleration for Protestants. So you can no longer be persecuted for being a Huguenot in France. Then, after Henry IV, we know that there will be a series of weaker kings, and so regents will be necessary. We know that Cardinal Richelieu, as the regent for Louis XIII, will be a major player in the wars of religion, finally deciding to side with the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. He was a politique. He believed that this would strengthen the position of France on the world stage with the balance of power by reducing the influence of the Habsburg family, both in Spain and in the Holy Roman Empire, and it worked. We know that eventually another cardinal, Cardinal Mazarin, will be the regent for Louis XIV before he is of age to rule outright. He will follow in the footsteps of Richelieu, building the power of the king, um, defending Louis XIV with the Fronde revolts when they happen. And of course, this will ultimately lead to France being able to become an absolute monarchy um, due to the buildup of power around the monarch. We'll talk more about that in um, a later PowerPoint. The 30 Years' War, as I alluded to before, 1618 to 1648. This is the last war of religion. It starts off, anyways, as a war of religion, as we know, but eventually it will, we see by the end of the war, it's more about balance of power and politics than it is about religion. We see this begins with the failure of that Peace of Augsburg that had maintained peace throughout the German provinces, with the princes choosing what religion their area, their principality would be. It starts because in Bohemia, they were Protestant. They eventually come under the leadership of the Habsburg, who wants to um, make Bohemia Catholic. There will be a rebellion. The Bohemian phase, the first phase of the war, 1618, 1625, the defenestration of Prague, where the representatives of the papacy and the Habsburgs are thrown out the window by the Bohemian Protestants, trying to defend themselves, their own freedom. Eventually, we will see that the Danes get involved, the Danish phase in 1625 to 1629, where the Protestants from Denmark get involved to try to reduce the power of the Holy Roman Emperor. They bring aid to the Protestants in Bohemia. Then eventually it leads to the Swedish phase, that where the Swedes get involved. Gustavus Adolphus, of course, the King of Sweden, who will be a very powerful military leader, successful for the Protestants. They will need the funding, however, of France. So remember, it's Swedish arms and French money in the Swedish phase, but eventually this will lead to, after the death of Gustavus Adolphus, even though they had victories in battles, the French will eventually start sending arms, and then you will have the Swedish helping to fund the French. You have Swedish money and French arms. The French phase, 1635 to 1648, is the last phase. This is where Cardinal Richelieu, remember, had decided that it was more important to support the Protestants in order to build up the power of France, to reduce the power of the Habsburgs, and ultimately this will lead to, the end of this war of attrition in 1648. This will be the Peace of Westphalia. So, the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, will end the wars of religion. France and Sweden will benefit greatly at this peace treaty negotiation. France annexes Alsace and Lorraine. This is the first time we see Alsace and Lorraine coming in the hands of France. As we know, it'll go back and forth between France and Germany, basically, through the years. Sweden gets territories in the Holy Roman Empire as well, so the power of the Holy Roman Empire is reduced greatly. The United Provinces and the Swiss Confederation were all recognized as being independent. Habsburg Spain is isolated from their Habsburg cousins in the Holy Roman Empire because the Holy Roman Empire is reduced in influence and in lands. And as we said, this is the last war that was originally fought for a religious reason. As we know, by the end, we already see, especially by the time, really by the time the Swedes get involved, it is no longer a war of religion. Instead, it is a war about balance of power, which will be the predominant motive for nations going to war against each other from this point forward. The English Civil War can also be viewed as a war of religion. James the first Stuart king, begins his reign in 1603 when Elizabeth I dies without an heir. He reigns from 1603 to 1625. He was a Catholic. He believed in the divine right of kings. Now ruling over a Protestant country, the British did not like that very much. Remember, he had been from Scotland. They were not happy with having a Catholic on the throne. Ultimately, however, there would be negotiations made that will stave off disaster during his lifetime, but his son Charles I inherits those problems. Now, Charles I was a Protestant, at least, in name. He will reign from 1625 to 1649, but he still believed in the divine right of kings, even though he recognized that, England would remain Protestant. Ultimately, this back and forth that he has with Parliament will lead to a civil war. He wanted to rule outright. He did not want Parliament challenging him, especially when it came to taxation, and this will lead to the English Civil War. 1642 to 1649. Ultimately, this was the Cavaliers, which were the royal supporters, versus the Roundheads, which were the supporters of Parliament, King versus Parliament. Ultimately, Charles I will be captured. He will be put on trial for treason against the people of England, and he will be beheaded. This will lead to the interregnum period, 1649 to 1660, where Oliver Cromwell, who had led the parliamentary forces, the New Model Army, that were the army for the Roundhead forces, he will be the head of the government for a while. It will be the Commonwealth. But ultimately, in 1660, after his death, England will return to monarchy. They will invite the son of Charles I, Charles II, to restore the monarchy to England as long as he agrees to certain terms. He's delighted. He's the merry monarch. He restores a lot of the culture that had been removed by the very Puritan Oliver Cromwell. He will reign from 1660 to 1685, but he has no legitimate heir. So when he dies, his younger brother, James II, becomes king. James II had recently married his second wife and converted to Catholicism because she was Catholic. And even though he had children from a previous marriage that had been raised Protestant, they were two girls, Mary and Anne. And so now his new wife has given him a son, and he swears he's going to raise him Catholic. And this is a problem for the British Parliament. They had signed the Test Act saying that no Catholic could ever rule England, and so therefore this will be a problem. This will eventually lead to the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution, 1688 to 1689, is where James II ultimately is overthrown without any blood being shed at all. That's why we call it the Glorious Revolution. He recognizes that there's nothing he can do after Parliament invites William of Orange, who had married the eldest daughter of James II, Mary Stuart. William and Mary of Orange are invited by the British Parliament to invade England and rule jointly, replacing her father, He bows out gracefully, kind of. Anyways, William and Mary will be joint monarchs and they will rule jointly with Parliament, signing the English Bill of Rights in 1689, which basically states that the King and Queen are not above the law, that they will share power with Parliament, that their power will be limited by the power of the people, and this is the beginning of constitutional monarchy in England. The Age of Exploration is another thing that comes from this first period in the 16th century primarily. The Age of Exploration, of course, begins largely because of the fall of Constantinople, remember in the Byzantine Empire in the Greek world, to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. When this happens, it profoundly changes international affairs because getting trade from that part of the world now will be more difficult because it is dominated by the Ottoman Turks. Wealthy Europeans demanded luxury goods from Asia, spices, opiates, silks, etc., and getting the goods past the Turkish coast ultimately cost more money. The Turks controlled the trade in that region, and so therefore it raised the price of commodities drastically, and that ultimately will be sort of one of the reasons why the Age of Exploration happens. The desire to gain direct trade routes from Europe to the Eastern territories, the spices, the silks, etc., by cutting out the middlemen. The Atlantic Five, meaning the five nations that dominate the Age of Exploration in the 16th century, it starts with Portugal and Prince Henry the Navigator, then moves on to Spain, okay, Ferdinand and Isabella, England with King James the First, France, and then the Netherlands. Portugal. Motives, of course, were economic, primarily, but also religious. Prince Henry the Navigator, 1394 to 1460, will kind of be the, I guess you would say, the one to fund the expeditions, wanting to find a direct route around Africa to get to the Indian Ocean trade. Bartholomew Diaz is one of the major explorers that will start going all the way around, the coast of Africa, eventually reaching the southern tip. Vasco da Gama is the one who is responsible for going around the Cape of Good Hope and making it all the way to India. Amerigo Vespucci will be a Portuguese explorer that will push westward, moving across the Atlantic Ocean, and eventually we see other Portuguese explorers will continue to push westward, founding Brazil eventually on the coastline of South America. In the 17th century, African slaves will be imported on Portuguese ships from Africa to the New World in exchange for coffee, cotton, and of course sugar, the big cash crop sugar. There will be significant racial mixing in Brazil as a result of this. They needed to import these African slaves because so many in the native population in the New World died because of the European diseases. And the African slaves seem to have immunities to the European diseases. So, technology, of course, was a big part of this. Cartography, meaning map making. As explorers went on journeys, they would come back with more information about what they saw, and they could draw better maps for later explorers to be able to use. Astronomy and instruments with astronomy would be useful to them, tracking where they were on the ocean, on the open ocean, by looking at the stars and knowing which direction they were heading. Newer instruments also, that some of them that they got from more contact with the east, like the magnetic compass, the geometric quadrant, so you can measure where you are by the stars. Mariner's astrolabe, the same, and the cross staff, all were instruments that would help them navigate. New ships being built, the caravels were built by Portugal. They had the lateen sail and rope riggings that made the ships faster. Axial rudders helped them to steer better, knowing where they were, being able to steer the ship better, and of course, gunpowder and cannons, when they come into contact with others, helped make them dominant on the seas and on land. The Portuguese discoveries and explorations, of course, the first arrival places and dates. You see here all throughout this map. You can study it more closely on your own. The main Portuguese spice trade routes in the Indian Ocean are in blue. Territories claimed during King John III's rule are in the 1530s are in green. Eventually, as Spain gets involved on the exploration game in 1492 with Ferdinand and Isabella funding Columbus's voyage, there becomes an argument between Spain and Portugal over who will have the rights to explore which areas. So, since both are Catholic nations, they turn to the Pope and asking him for guidance, and this will lead to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which will form a line of demarcation. Anything to the west of the line will be reserved for Spain to explore. Anything to the east of the line will be reserved for Portugal. At the time that the treaty was signed, Spain thought that they got the shorter end of the stick, if you will. They had no idea that there was two whole other continents over there and an entire another ocean. As we know, Spain will eventually figure this out, sending more explorers westward, and the New World is founded. All right, so Christopher Columbus, as we know, his expedition was funded by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, 1492. He proposed a trade route to Asia by going west, thus bypassing the Turks. And Ferdinand and Isabella will finance the expedition along with the Genoese merchants who had formed a kind of joint stock company, if you will, to help fund the expedition since Columbus was from Genoa. This will eventually, his discoveries, even though he thought he was in Asia initially, will lead to more Spanish explorers pushing westward once they determine, oh, look, we have found a whole nother world over here, two new continents. 1474 to 1566 are the years for Bartolomé de las Casas. He wrote a brief account on the destruction of the Indies, having traveled with other explorers, and he criticized the treatment of the Amerindians that happened due to the Spanish expeditions westward. And he ultimately criticized that, one of the earliest critics of the treatment of the natives. That did not stop the Spanish from their treatment, though, and as we see here, the colonial class structure that will be in New Spain or in the New World will be the Peninsulares at the top. They were Spaniards, pure-blood Spaniards born in Spain. The Creoles were born in New Spain, of course, of Spanish parents, so they were still full-blooded Spanish, but born in the New World. Mestizos were born of Spanish and Native American Indian parents. Then, of course, the Native American Indians under them, and the enslaved persons brought from Africa and the Caribbean after that. The Columbian Exchange, you can observe this map as one that we've seen before, showing us what products went from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia. And then, of course, what products went from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas. This is named after Columbus because of the Columbian Exchange. As we know, part of the Columbian Exchange will also be diseases that were brought from Europe to the New World and vice versa, having a major impact in particular on the native populations in the New World. However, one of the most important products that was brought from the New World to Europe, as we have discussed before, is the almighty potato. You see right there at the top. It will change the diet of Europeans forever. It's very high calorie, easy to grow, cheap, and it will stave off starvation, reducing the amount of famines that happen in Europe for quite some time. England was later to the exploration game, if you will. They got into it when they hired actually a Frenchman, John Cabot, to push westward. And eventually, this will lead to other expeditions. In the early 1600s, the first colony that would be established by England will be at Jamestown. And then after that, far more English came to the northwest compared to the Spanish going into the southern parts of the New World. As we know, the Spanish had already laid claim to Florida, but eventually the British will get a hold of Florida. Then it'll go back to Spain, and of course, then it will become part of America after the American Revolution. France will be later in on the game as well. Jacques Cartier was one of the earliest French explorers that was sent officially by France, and eventually his expeditions will lead to others to be sent. The first French colony that would be established will be in Quebec, Canada, 1608. The Dutch Republic also gets in on this fever. The Netherlands, the ones that had wrenched themselves free from Spanish control. They will establish a joint stock company to fund an expedition. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company is founded. They will eventually start their own journeys around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, moving into the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Eventually, the Dutch will be able to expel the Portuguese from some of the Spice Islands, Ceylon and Indonesia, and gain control over that area, replacing the Portuguese there. This is one of the reasons why the Portuguese amped up the slave trade after this. After losing control of the Spice Islands, they will instead make their money through the slave trade. Here's colonial expansion showing you different nations, different colors, the areas that they took over. New monarchs was another theme that we talked about in period one. As we know, the new monarchs, roughly 1460 to 1550, they were the first phase moving monarchs towards absolute power, breaking the back of the feudal traditions that had been in place during the Middle Ages. New monarchs will consolidate their power and create the foundation for Europe's first modern nation states in places like France, England, and Spain. The keys to new monarchs' power was that they had to reduce the power of the nobles through taxation, through confiscation of lands, and the use of sometimes mercenary armies, but the ideal is to have their own standing armies that they pay for rather than depending on the nobles to provide those forces. They also need to reduce the political power of the clergy in their realms, whether that be by converting to Protestantism or at least just making the Catholic clergy kowtow to royal power. That's what will happen in France with Louis XI, the Spider King. They will also create more efficient bureaucracies, usually by utilizing the I guess you would say upper middle class, so it's merchant class, as part of their bureaucracies, manning their bureaucracies rather than depending on the nobles to do that. Again, that's another way they can reduce the power of the nobles. And of course, all of this increases public debt because they have to take out loans from merchant bankers in order to build up those armies and build up their power base and not be dependent upon the nobles. So that's why merchant bankers like the Medici family in Italy, in Florence, Italy, will become so important and powerful throughout Europe. They had banks all over Europe, and they would fund a lot of these new monarchs as they are trying to consolidate their power.